Hello, viewers. Welcome back to Candid Conversations with Ganesh Kuppala. By the way, first of all, I want to wish a happy International Women's Day to all the amazing women out there and all my audience as well. So, as part of that, I want to bring the best guest for today's special episode. We have Obi James with us, who's your listing. I mean, achievements are amazing, Obi. But I will call out few here for my audience. She's author of a great book, and she's also a leader, coach, mentor, and she runs her own firm, Obi James Consulting, as well. And you're the founder of Obi James, and you're a managing director as well. So there's a lot of stuff that we need to understand and know about Obi, and we will dwell into those conversations today. Thank you so much, Obi, for your time and coming to our show. It's our pleasure. Let's get started with your introduction quickly. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me, Ganesh.
Yeah. So why don't we quickly get started with your intro, Obi? I know I said few of your achievements, but to start with, like how were you as a kid, girl, child, somewhere? I'm sure you're not from UK. No. So can we get some background of where you started your journey from?
What a beautiful start. I like that. So what was I as a child? I was born in Germany, actually.
Brilliant.
But my parents moved back to Nigeria when I was a toddler. So I don't remember much of Nigeria, of Germany,
yeah.
Except maybe videos and clips from those old videos and that you watch as children. But I moved back to Nigeria when I was 2 or 3 years old and grew up in the southeastern part of Nigeria, Anambra State. My parents ran a hospital there. So I often say I grew up in a hospital, not as a patient, but the child.
They ran hospital. Were they doctors? Or?
They were both doctors.
Oh,
so my
brilliant.
father went from Nigeria he got a scholarship and went from Nigeria to Germany to go to medical school. And my mother went from Finland to Germany to medical school. So they met in medical school, got married, had the kids, the three of us, and then moved back to Nigeria to run a hospital in the southern east or southeastern part of Nigeria, Anambra State.
Brilliant.
And what's fascinating about that is that they didn't move to the big cities. They moved back to home. And my father was always very keen on going back home and contributing and being close to his family, his mother in the village, his sisters in the village, and so he ran a hospital in a part of Anambra State called Oka, and then also had a clinic in the village. So I grew up as a young child in a hospital, went to nursery school, primary school in Nigeria, went to secondary school as well in Nigeria, and only moved to Finland at the end of my secondary school education.
Okay.
Lived there for 3 years.
So you moved by yourself, not the parents this time.
I moved by myself.
Okay, that's amazing.
I moved into my first home. I think I was 17 or 18 years old.
Oh, right.
And actually, it's quite an interesting story, which I don't think I've ever spoken about. So this is quite a good start. So I went to Helsinki, and I went to an English school in Finland.
Okay.
And I lived in a small studio flat, and I used to go to school. This is like to convert my A levels into the Finnish and UK ones, and I used to then work as a babysitter, as a nanny.
Oh,
so
okay.
I was working in the early mornings, take the kids to school, the kids I was a nanny to, and then go off to my own studies, and then I'd pick them back up from school. So I started work at a very young age, actually.
Brilliant. That's amazing. So in Finland, you lived most of your life there after like your schooling, or then
3
you moved
years.
to 3 years, just 3 years. Okay.
So
Okay.
I very quickly, I knew I wasn't going to stay in Finland.
Okay.
And when I moved to London in the late 90s, I didn't know anyone in London.
Okay.
So maybe it might be similar to your story.
Yeah.
I knew a couple of people, but not closely. So I moved here to go to university and absolutely loved it. And
Which one did you go to?
I went to University College London, UCL.
Wow.
And
amazing.
I went to UCL to study physiology. So stayed in a hall of residence and fell in love with London, actually.
It's amazing. Brilliant. So from then you moved on to financial services sector, is it?
Yes.
And where did you start and what happened? The reason I want to understand this, because when I looked at your profile, the kind of stuff that you've done is extensive and very, very impressive. Obi, I must say that. But I wanted to understand, like, what made you to do all that stuff?
So
I just wanted to see how I connect the dots, basically. Yeah.
Very good question.
Yeah.
So I studied physiology, medical sciences at university probably because my parents were doctors. You might get that, how you get a little bit of a steer as you're growing up. And when I graduated from UCL, I moved, the first place I lived in, somewhere in London, in Golders Green.
Okay.
I remember walking past a recruitment agency and I was like, oh, what do these guys do? And I went in to have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to whoever I was speaking to at the time, I must find out who it is, that I wanted to do anything non-science related. I was like, I've grown up in a hospital.
Enough of science now.
My dad was a surgeon. My mum was a psychiatrist, or is a psychiatrist. And I wanted to kind of experience what it's like not to do sciences. And I was very almost commercially ignorant, to be fair. I was always in the lab. In my latter years at uni. So yeah, I went in to speak to them, and they said, we do recruitment, we recruit for accountants, and you'll relate to this. So, and I said, yeah, so, what could I do? And the lady I was speaking to at the time said to me, you could work for us. We've got a graduate program, we've got XYZ. And so I ended up becoming a recruitment consultant.
Amazing.
So Hayes Accountancy Personnel.
Didn't
last very long, but that was my first steer away from sciences and the medical field. Although I did come back.
Brilliant. And how did you move into consulting then? So what made you to start your own firm?
Yeah.
You call it as particularly consulting. I know what leadership consulting is, what you do primarily.
Yeah.
So what was that journey, transition?
So I went from Hayes into Deloitte, and then Morgan Stanley, and then Bank of America, and then Northern Trust. And then
all the big names.
All the big names. Spent a lot of hours at work in those. I still do to an extent. But it was interesting. The move for me out of the corporate world or financial services and to set up my own consultancy actually came from when I was pregnant with my first child. So I remember thinking about what it was I got from my childhood that I valued the most, and beyond my values and our family values, what I really wanted for my children. And I knew that I wanted to be more available to them. So not necessarily work less hours, but be reachable whenever they needed me. So one of the things that I valued hugely, and I had never really reflected on this until I was pregnant and I was about to have my own child, was that I could always reach my dad. I was very close to my dad. I was called my dad's handbag. I was everywhere with him. So I think that that recognition that I wanted my kids to access me whenever they needed me, and I also really wanted them to grow up with the values that I grew up with, and I felt that it was really important for me to be very present as they grew up, and I just couldn't do the hours, and so that was one reason. That steered me into kind of, I could do my own thing. The second one, specifically to coaching, which is what I really started with, was then reflecting on what I would do if I was to leave the corporate world or employment. And I realized that the part of my role I loved the most, I think I had so many roles, job titles when I was at Northern Trust specifically, but I think my last one was strategic program manager or something to do with L&D. I was in learning and development and did a lot of leadership development work and working with the leaders. I realized that the part of my role I loved the most was actually the individual one-to-one work I did with my business partners, coaching them and kind of helping them understand what they wanted to bring to leadership, but also how do they get the best out of their people. So I was working with them around talent management, succession planning, and I thought, I love this area where we get to talk about your own vision and your own leadership and who you are. And so that inspired me to study, to go out and study to be a coach.
Brilliant.
And so I started out as a leadership coach.
While I'm thinking about it, right, while the way you explained your journey, I mean, the way I connect the dots here, again, me doing this out of curiosity, right? as a child, you were very close to two of the doctors, your mom and dad, who actually left something probably lucrative and went back to own country, working for the people.
Yes.
So the people connection there.
Absolutely.
And then you moved into a different cultures. You lived in Finland, you lived in various, you came back to London, and then you touched various cultures as part of your life. What is common everywhere is the people.
Yes.
And when it comes to people, there's always leadership.
Very true.
So that's how probably kind of leader was always there within you, who kind of came up and said, okay, this is what I want you to do now.
Yeah.
Probably that's how it's turned.
I love that connection. I think it's a great way to think about it, because I grew up so close, not just to my parents, but because we lived in the hospital. My mom would run all these training courses for the nurses, and I'd sit there and look at them drawing the different parts of the human body. And so I grew up with that kind of watching my parents do that. But also they were very unique in the way that they worked. They were, it's just like back to what you were saying about the people.
Yeah.
They were very, very people focused. I mean, you might relate to this from a cultural perspective as well. That everything was about the people. There wasn't a doctor-patient relationship. These were our friends. These were our, these were our family. These are people that even though they're admitted into the hospital, we'd eat with them. So it was a very different type of relationship to maybe the relationship we see in the UK and in other kind of Western countries. So yes, there's definitely something there about the connection piece, the people piece, and then just always having leadership modeled in a beautiful way.
It's amazing. Wow, beautiful journey, right? Okay, let me now touch quickly on the consulting piece of it, like what you do specifically on your role. Then I want to go deep into like what it means to my audience and the larger folks, right? So in terms of your day-to-day role, if I have to call Obie one day and say, how is your day looking like? What's your day? What's your day? What's your normal day?
Oh my goodness. It's never the same. Everyone says that, right? No 2 days are the same. I think it varies hugely.
Okay.
And I could, let me have a think. So I could be meeting with a leader and their boss. So I'm trying to think about last week. So I had a 3-way meeting for an exec coaching client that I'm working with, and I met with him and the CEO of the company because he's the successor.
Yeah.
And I work as a systemic coach in that. I work as a systemic coach generally, but in that piece of work, when it comes to exec coaching and leadership coaching as a whole, I like to look systemically and to look at not just having a ceiling to the coaching and I'm just coaching an individual and their perspective. I bring in a lot of other voices. So it was a meeting with his boss, the CEO, to kind of look at his perspective on what's needed and what succession looks like. And then I was speaking at the HR Vision event last week. So a day could go from an individual meeting to a speaking engagement to coaching a team. So I work with leadership teams collectively, and I take them through a coaching journey or program. Or I might be running a 2-day leadership development program or speaking at a conference. So it is so varied. But I also do other things outside of consulting. So I have a portfolio career.
Very busy day. So I remember one of my mentors used to say this, like, so I've asked him, I was probably a 12-year-old boy, and I've asked him, like, how do you grow generally? What is that makes you grow as an individual? And this answer always stuck in my mind, and I'll probably bring it to you, and I want to get your reflections, because we are talking about leaders, right? Because most of the leaders' day is extremely busy.
Yes.
Right? And they're doing something and they're running through stuff and all that stuff. The reason I'm bringing that guru's example is he told me, I've grown when I did nothing.
Yes.
Which is very, very insightful. I know it's a very small statement, but what he's saying is, like, I'm doing this X, Y, Z, 10 things a day. But when I sat alone, did nothing and reflected on the 10 minutes or 15 minutes of my time, that's when I actually have grown from point X to point Y.
That's a beautiful response.
Right. So how do you reflect on this? Do you think leaders are doing this enough? because I'm a leader as well. I'm a director in a firm, and that always stayed with me. And when I try to mentor my colleagues, or so the way I tell them is that are you giving enough of time for yourself to grow?
Yes.
Are you may be getting promotions, you may be getting the whatever you call it as the fancy titles and all, but are you actually growing?
Yes.
And what's your reflection on
That's
this?
a beautiful question. I actually write about that in the book. There's a term for it called Nixon, which is it's almost an extension to. It's not mindfulness, but it's close. I trained. I'm actually a mindfulness trainer in terms of having for my own personal development. But I think that you're absolutely right. I think the leaders, we're all going all the time. And I think that there's something about integration and assimilation of the things we learn, and we have to be intentional about it. So I'm very, every year I talk about creating a vision board at the end of every year. I go away to a spa every year to work on my vision board for the next year. And there's a whole kind of ritual of kind of putting down all the stuff from the previous year and then being intentional about the next year. And something that always stays on my vision board is spaciousness. I genuinely believe in the need to think and the time to think. And to be fair, that's what leaders get from exec coaching. And that's what leadership teams get from leadership team coaching. I often say to them, it's less about what we bring, it's that we force you to be here because we're holding you accountable to creating space. Either to think on your own or to think collectively. I don't think I could cope without space to think or without not doing anything. I intentionally create that. I do have a lot of spaciousness because I'm quite disciplined in my work as well.
Brilliant.
So as disciplined as I am in my work, I'm that disciplined in my spaciousness. I think we all need to do that as leaders, because also just for your mental health, right? It's part of self-care.
Brilliant. So you brought up a very interesting topic about mental health there. By the way, you probably know Tony, Mindfulness Guru, right? I was with him last week in Dubai. So we were in a global summit and we did this 1 hour session in the morning, and there was like 45, 50 CEOs from across the globe sat in that room. It was extraordinary vision for me because these are all people who would be doing exceptional stuff on their day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Who all sat for 45 minutes doing nothing.
Beautiful.
But listening to somebody saying that, now think about it, breathe in, breathe out, all that stuff. It was amazing. So the reason it actually ignited few thoughts in my mind is that, when your mind stays calm, stable, what it can bring to the world is exceptionally different than when you're rushing into things. And how important it is for a leader to kind of listen to the stuff that he has done by himself, or is it like, does coaching help, or it's more they need to learn from themselves? I just want to understand, the mindfulness coaching and all that stuff is very popular now.
Yes.
But do you try to kind of bring them into a direction where they think about themselves in a direction where they have to find answers by self?
Of course.
Or you'll find
so at the start of our conversation, when I said I came back to sciences, I still really am a scientist in a lot of ways. My favorite module at university was neuroscience. And I guess I come from a family that there's quite a lot of focus on mental health. My sister is a mental health pharmacist, and my mum's a psychiatrist, and my auntie's a psychiatrist. So you can imagine what our dinner conversations look like. But it's a really valuable question to think about. Actually, where does it all fit in, and how does it all fit together? I think with the leaders, this idea of, first of all, being rather than doing is so crucial. And I think when we understand the physiology of it, and then when we understand that actually our brain engages we engage a different part of our brain when we're calm, when we're mindful, when we're present, when we're not doing anything. And actually, it's that part of our brain that is more that releases the hormones that allow our brain to be calmer and to come up with better ideas and better thinking. And we're not working from that kind of amygdala hijack, freeze, fight or flee response place, which is very kind of adrenaline, testosterone, stress hormones filled, and that can make us trip up as well. So I think it also impacts our performance. So we know that when you have when you're having a shower or at night when you lay your head to sleep, and then all the amazing ideas come, and you're like, oh, now I have to get up and think, write something, or I don't want to lose this idea. It's because we've actually engaged that part of our brain and we've calmed down.
So true. Actually, I want to tell you my personal stuff as well. So when I go to shower, I come back, I have a notepad. Believe me, I have a notepad right in front of my washroom. I open it and write a lot of stuff. Because a lot of poetry, I mean, I do write some poetry and I do some stuff. Like, you heard about my story as well. So I do write some stuff. But most of my writings comes from when I do nothing.
Yes.
And it's an exceptional learning, yeah. I completely agree to your thought process, about how I think this is extremely important for leaders to think about this. And because what I noticed, at least in the last decade, I mean, I've been working for 2 decades, but the difference that I've noticed in the leadership in the last 2 decades, a decade back, leaders had time to think about the things. They had space, what you're talking about. But in this decade, especially in the last 5 years where AI, ML, too much rush. There's so many things happening and people want to kind of chase everything in a minute. And what I noticed is they all go and crash at some place, come back again, do the same things. How do you avoid this? So when do the leaders know this is going to happen?
The second part of your previous question about the coaching. I've always had coaching. I think it's the biggest gift an organization can give a leader. And I think that it's the biggest gift we can give ourselves, even if we don't get that from our organization. And I think it is that space to think. Oftentimes I have people come into sessions, whether it's individuals or teams, and there's this franticness to how we work. And we just say, okay, let's just land. What's here now? It's one of the biggest questions I ask teams. What's here now? And oftentimes we don't take a minute to just think, what's here right now? And we don't gauge that. We're just going all the time. So I think that this need in time to think has to be intentionally plugged into our lives, because the pace of life and the pace of work doesn't allow for it. And that's why you have coaching sessions, or you plug it in however you plug it in. It might be that you force yourself to go to the gym, or you go for a run in the morning. That's the only time you get your me time. But those are such crucial parts of leadership in order for it to be sustainable. And I worry sometimes when I see leaders who are so frantic that it becomes the culture, because it seeps through the culture. Right, and in a lot of ways we have to model for our children and our people at work or beyond self-care and how to be intentional. Sometimes my daughters, I've got 2 teenage daughters, when they're frantic, I might hear the older one would say to the younger one, okay, I just need 5 minutes to think. Can everyone give me, and so I think we need to kind of do that as leaders and teach our young ones to do that and say, actually, I need time to think, but it's something that is a worry for me, because you can see that it's almost like a crisis point, because where do we go with it all? AI now makes it even quicker. It's like everybody's is trying to kind of outspeed the other one, and those that aren't able to keep up with that space naturally, then doubt and question themselves, because it's not the norm anymore to be spacious. I'm not even talking about not doing anything. I'm talking about just working at what should be a normal space, normal speed. So it's something that we do need to look at, especially as technology moves quicker, because we're human and our brain is different.
I know. That makes a lot of sense. And you rightly pointed out couple of things in this coaching space. But I want to quickly cover one additional question, because you deal with a lot of leadership people and all this CXO level people, right? I mean, CEOs, COOs, and all that stuff. Maybe it's a tricky question, but I want you to be really honest, okay? Do you think they are connected to the roots? Once, somebody who spent 25, 30 years in the career, so when they're analyst, like for example, you are on the ground, you know the stuff, you've been doing things, you know how a colleague feels, and you know how a failure feels. And most of the successful people, men or women, very exclusively, here I want to call out, because I personally think women are more connected, maybe because of the, people, they make sure that, the kids grow with moms a lot and all that stuff probably comes in. Probably they're more grounded. I don't know. I'm not again, unconscious bias aside, but what I see personally is that disconnect as you grow is extremely high. And I noticed it in a lot of conversations. I do some mentoring as well. And when I go back to people and say that, have you actually spoken to one of your analysts in the last 6 months?
Yeah.
You're a CEO, brilliant. You do exceptional stuff. You're very successful, but do you really understand your ground? Do you know how an analyst feels?
Yeah.
Have you done that? Do you see that a lot?
I see that a lot, and I think the world is a little better.
That's good.
In some places. I think we have to be careful that we don't generalize. There are some organizations that do remarkably well.
That's amazing.
When it comes to making sure that they can see across the whole organization. I think the way they do it is, especially these kind of, C-suite leaders, is that they put in systems and processes in place. Right, because what you don't want to do is to now say you have to be able to speak to everyone, and at the same time as we're saying that actually, how do you do it? It's interesting. There's an exec I'm coaching at the moment who's tackling a similar challenge because his role's hugely expanded, and that's what he's known for, really being close to everyone and being able to be, being accessible. But at some point that becomes unrealistic, and there are ways you do it, and through things like all staff sessions. I think there's something about building accountability across your organization and being very clear and transparent about what is the culture, what you expect, and that you want your leaders to shape within your organization. And most importantly, how do you hold people accountable? How do you hold your leaders accountable? And how do people access you when they need you? So it's not really, when it comes to inclusion and the work I do with leaders, it's not necessarily about hearing every voice. It's very much about, are we capturing all the perspectives? Are we able to kind of get deep into the organization enough to understand what different people's experiences are? And where we're not doing that, are we asking enough questions, and do people feel safe enough to be able to speak up when things aren't going well for them or when they're being excluded? So it's
interesting. I don't know if you have seen this, Obie, but I'll bring this example to you. Stephen Bartlett, everyone knows, probably very popular. So he posted something just 2 weeks back in LinkedIn, saying that he's hiring head of happiness. There's a role in the flight, the organization where Stephen Bartlett is. They're hiring head of happiness. That was interesting. Strategically, amazing move. And also, it triggers a question to everyone. When I say, again, the reason I'm bringing this question is I understand completely C-suite leadership is extremely busy. They can't do it, and it's not practical to go and speak to everyone, right? But do they have enough delegation that can bring them? I mean, I can't speak to 10,000 people. Like there are places like, the Big Four or other, where you have 400,000 employees. It's impractical to speak to them. But do you have enough delegation which can bring you that perspective?
Yes.
Can you see that world through someone else's eyes? What's your thoughts on that? I mean, what's your reflection on head of happiness, by the way?
Yeah, I'm not sure about head of happiness, and I'm trying to think why I had a reaction to that. I think head of happiness, it's a great thing to name it.
Yeah.
And it depends on what you call happiness,
Yeah.
right? Because happiness for you might be very different to happiness to
subjective.
me, right?
Yeah.
And I also think that when we look at inclusion, I think we need head of curiosity, right?
Very interesting.
I'm gonna write that somewhere. I think we need a head of curiosity because sometimes there's even pressure on the head of whatever
Yeah.
to then be the expert.
Yeah.
I would not want to be a head of happiness because I'm not always
can't be
happy.
an expert.
No, like, so how do I model that
Yeah.
in terms of happiness? But I think it's a great aspiration for an organization to have and for a CEO to name that they want to have a head of happiness or they want happiness as an agenda in line with a lot of other things. So I think we need more curiosity. I quite similar actually to your previous question as well. I think we just need to ask more questions. And one of the things that we don't do well as leaders in a lot of places, I would be jobless if we did this well, is we don't ask questions. I think that there's an inclination or even an expectation that a leader has to know the answers. And we put all these pressures on ourselves. And that's what really marginalizes diversity.
Brilliant.
Because
That reminds me of one thing. So sorry to cut you
Go ahead.
flow, but very interesting. I was a part of. I was in an interview for a TV show like few months back, and the moderator asked me a question: "Who do you miss the most?" And because he knew my story and all that stuff, but I said I miss my own 11-year-old the most.
your own
11-year-old, the me at 11-year-old is what I miss the most because that 11-year-old boy had a lot of questions. That 11-year-old boy had amazing dreams to achieve. That 11-year-old boy had no one to tell him that something is not possible. That 11-year-old boy had enormous amount of confidence on self that he can do anything in this world.
Yeah.
When I'm learned more, I'm 39-year-old now, I have a lot of blockers.
Yeah.
I know because I'm conscious that, okay, this is not practical. I can't do this. Because I've learned more, the learnings bringing me blockers.
Yeah.
How do you see this? So when this question came to me, I said, that boy had nothing stopping him.
Yeah.
But today, there is so many things stops me. And it's not external, it's internal. It's me who's stopping me, no one else. The only reason I'm stopping myself is because I understand that I can't do this. I know if someone tells me, can you run a 100-meter sprint in 11 seconds, I would say, oh, practically it's not possible. But this 11-year-old boy would have said, why not? I can do it. But how do you see this? And how do you break this challenge?
Gosh, I feel like I was moving from reminding myself I'm not coaching, which is very important, to almost wanting to be that 11-year-old boy to say, why couldn't you do it?
Yeah.
But I do think mindset is a huge thing, and I think that there is something about self-leadership and how we're socialized and how we grow up and how we, you've talked about biases before. But the things we tell ourselves, a lot. We all have limiting beliefs. Everyone has something, that voice that tells you that you're not capable or you're not able to do something, or it keeps you small. It makes you play small.
Yeah.
And part of our role as leaders is to help our people to navigate that.
Yeah.
But also we have our own work to do around that in terms of how do we build agency to get to study ourselves. And I actually think mindfulness helps with that. Because if you're present, you catch your thinking. And we know that our thinking influences how we feel from CBT, from cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
We know that thinking affects how I feel, which then affects how I show up in the world. So if I'm present enough and mindful enough, I'm able to catch those thinking and then actually do work with it. And that then impacts how I feel, and then that impacts how I show up. So, it's that mindset shift that needs to happen. And we don't do enough to develop and help our leaders to work on that mindset. So you might have leaders who are 100 years of experiences. They've got 100 years of experience, and but they still have that voice, and they still are not equipped to deal with that voice because they haven't had the privilege of getting to know themselves and getting to question that voice and say, actually, why can't you do it? And then I think it speaks to not just the coaching, but the mentoring and who are the people that are asking you those questions, and when you can't access your 11-year-old self, which I'm sure you access sometimes, who's there to help you access it? That's the support network. Those are the people we want to have around us, because those are the people that kind of challenge that kind of limiting belief and say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Let's look at another perspective.
So true, so true. And I actually, after that interview, I try to do this in the last 6 months at least.
Yeah.
Whenever there's a challenge comes in, I write answers in three parameters.
Beautiful.
One, a 13-year-old, 23-year-old, and 11-year-old. If Ganesh Kuppala is 20-year-old now,
Yes.
how would he look at this challenge?
Oh, I love
And
that.
Ganesh Kuppala, he's 11-year-old. How would he look at his challenge? And whatever, or Ganesh Kuppala at 39-year-old. These are the three perspectives I write.
Yeah.
And I recommend people to do this as well,
Yes.
honestly. But if it is practical for you, again, I'm not coaching here. I'm not a certified coach. But what works for me, I'll tell you. What works for me.
Yes.
Out of these three, what do you call it as trends or, age gaps or whatever, like, different thought processes. 80 out of 100 times, I loved my 23-year-old.
Tell me more about the 23-year-old. I'm interviewing you now.
Yeah. So the 23-year-old had a lot of inquisitiveness, extreme positive energy, and a lot of strengths. He's this guy, the man who can run, do things and all. At the same time, he has the child in him. He knows, he was the bridge between these two, 39 and 11, who has the experience of doing things and the naivety of not knowing enough. I thought that's a brilliant blend of combination. And that's exactly how the leadership should happen, is what I realized, at least,
Yes.
in my challenges, and went back and doing that. And I've been really successful doing that.
Sounds amazing.
Right? So I think, now I have one more question, which is again coming back to the cultures, leadership primarily, because you're a leadership coach. I would want my audience to understand a lot of leadership stuff from you today. That's the reason I'm asking all the questions.
Of course, that's fine.
So the question is, you have lived in Nigeria, one of the biggest countries in Africa. You lived in Finland, and you also lived in Europe. You'll probably worked across the globe, working with banks and all. How do you see the differences in the culture impacting the leadership? Is it more driven? I mean, because I was reading a study, and maybe I'm subject to correction. A lot of the Middle East leadership, Middle East is growing extensively,
Yes.
right? Had Lebanese and Egyptian leadership for extensively. And if you look at the top 30 IT leaders in the world right now are all Indians, for example, like 80 to 90% of them. The top 10, like Google's,
Yeah.
Microsoft's,
Yeah.
Shivanadar, everyone, like, Satya, Sundar, Indian origin. So is it more of a trend? I'm just trying to do a research. I'm sure you would have done on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, is there a reason certain backgrounds works in leadership, or is it probably just timing? This is how it works.
I think it's that's an interesting question, and I would dig deeper into the lives of those individual leaders, right? Because someone's from somewhere doesn't mean they're even connected
Exactly.
to that place. But it's a very fascinating question, and I think a lot of it has to do with culture, as you said, assuming that let's take Nigeria as an example. You could almost look at what unites us as Nigerians, right? The values, and India would,
Similar.
be the same. There's something about family.
Yeah.
There's something about respect. It's in your DNA. Respect is one of my strongest values, and ultimately same for my kids.
Yeah.
So because it's in me, it's in them, because that's how they're raised. They haven't grown up in Nigeria, and but they still hold the same values. So I think that goes with you from a cultural kind of movement perspective. I do think it influences our leadership. I think it influences what we see and what we don't see. But also it can have a flip side, right? Because it can also make you exclude if you're not careful. So again, it goes back to, I think cultural intelligence is very important for leaders, regardless of where you come from. The need to understand and get curious about what things look like in other places, from other perspectives, from what's a different way of looking at things than what I naturally come into. Very much like you were describing in terms of your own experiences. So it does play a role. I don't know about identity. Maybe identity is a different way.
I didn't mean identity, to be honest. I want to correct it if it was coming across that way. But
no.
My point of view is why there are trends, like in the last 10 years or 20 years, you see certain level of leadership.
Yeah.
If you go back and see from 1800s to 2025, every 30, 40 years, you will see leadership changes, huge leadership changes.
Yes.
Like UK led the whole world for a number of years. And then United States, it could be different reasons. Why? One is your finance, economic conditions, where you're coming from, education, the kind of background you have, or the timing of, like, for example, technology is the booming thing for the last 30 years. And naturally, South Indians are more tech people because every second household in South India has an engineer at home.
So there's a privilege.
Yeah. So
right?
Because it's not designed that way, but
it is the way
that's
it
how
is.
they are.
Yeah.
So it helped because of the timing, right?
Yeah,
It has
yeah.
so when you have 1.5 billion people,
Yeah.
and like that's our country. India is 1.5 billion people, and half of your South India is like more focused on engineers. It's quite obvious you will have a lot of engineers coming out. So it's more driven by the culture.
Yeah.
It's again trending, right? And similarly, the reason I was talking about Middle East is the same thing. Like, when they had no opportunities in Egypt, for example, they would have been going to UAE or somewhere, and they started working where UAE was probably settling down and more relaxed. These set of people came into the country and started working very hard and then became leaders. So it's nothing to do with your identity, but it's your situations which drives the leadership, is what I'm trying to say.
And that's a really great clarification, because in a lot of ways we are a combination of so many different factors, right? And I think one of the things that happens to us is, as we grow up, when I talk about inclusion and I talk about workplaces, it still starts with self. Right. So we need to think about, how do you look at yourself and look at the wholeness of yourself, and which parts of yourself do you marginalize, or have you marginalized because of experiences you've had, right? And you gradually chip away at it. So you might still be like Obie, but it's Obie that doesn't recognize this part of herself because she's had this experience, or she doesn't recognize, and over time it's like, who is this person? So I think it still starts with the individual, right? But I love what you're pointing to, which is that when you have a core experience, like the engineering example you gave, then you've got a foundation that in a way is a privilege. And that foundation is what then kind of drives the broadness of those people at a given time. So I'd never even heard that experience, or that kind of combination
right?
of
So
the
if you look
engineers in the home,
Correct.
and then 30 years later,
they'll become leaders, right?
Very
Similarly, if you look at music industry,
yeah,
you will see
yes,
certain number of musicians becoming really popular, and if you come back and their backgrounds look similar,
yeah,
right? I think that's how the world is, probably. Okay. And now I have one question specific to UK and this part of the world, because back in India, maybe it's because of the ignorance or whatever, like things like neurodiversity, autism were not a lot of spoken content in India, because I mean, again, due respect to every country and culture, right? But third world countries, or G7 you call it as, or developing nations, the problems are different.
yeah.
The problems are still education, getting education for every child, or feeding them, meal a day, all that stuff becomes a larger problem. So when it comes to a developed set of the country, you have mental health, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Again, these are different backgrounds and all. But what I noticed in the last few years, especially in UK, the number of identification of autism or neurodiversity, or the cases with dyslexia, or all that stuff, is growing extensively. And all these kids will become workforce tomorrow, right? and have become workforce already, the previous
Yeah.
generations. Because I worked with a few of my colleagues who were like, who had autism, and they were brilliant, brilliant colleagues. But yeah, they were proud enough to talk about their own self, and they were, very courageous to come out and say, okay, I have this problem, and this is how I handle it. And we actually tweaked our ways of working because they were exceptional talents. They wouldn't stop. Again, coming back to the inclusion topic, what is your take on this? Like, have you worked with any of the leaders who had these challenges but exceptionally successful, like leaders with autism, leaders with neurodiverse issues?
Yes, I coach a few,
Yeah.
and I have some neurodiverse relatives as well, and I actually think that the problem is not they have no problem. The problem is the system. Because of we live in a neurotypical world where neurotypical systems are in place, and so we find that in a lot of workplaces, again, a lot of people haven't taken the time to get curious to learn about the diversity of people. So when we create systems based on neurotypical colleagues, then things become a challenge because we see things a different way. I was speaking about this, or I wrote about this on one of my LinkedIn articles, that I didn't realize my local station didn't have a lift until I was heavily pregnant and then realized that I had to take the stairs. And it was the first time I noticed that the lift didn't exist at the station. And I think that's the same thing. I think that when I speak about privileges, we all hold a lot of privileges. And one of the reasons we need to get really curious about the privileges that we hold is that if we don't learn and find out what these privileges are, we inadvertently abuse them.
Yeah.
And if we then abuse them, we're not being inclusive.
So true.
Right. And so that curiosity, that understanding ourselves, like you were speaking to earlier, that you're taking a lot of time to reflect. And I love that, I love that about you based on, the conversations we've had so far, that you're very reflective in terms of, who was I at 13 and who was I at 23 and who am I now and how does it all relate? And what can I offer the world? And I think that's a really crucial piece of work that we all have to do. And part of it is looking at where might we have had challenges or have challenges, and where do we hold privileges? And when we hold privileges that we have not earned, we just have them because the world is created a certain way.
Brilliant.
It is our job to make sure that we use them in service of the people that don't have the benefit of those privileges. So when I think about neurodiversity, it's actually something I hold strongly. Same as mental health, that we need to kind of do more. For those of us that kind of hold the privileges that others don't hold, to make sure that we're part of the solution of making the world more inclusive for everyone. When we look at then the other part of your question, which is around the kind of the country piece or the cultural piece, you're very right. I think things are seen very differently in India or in Nigeria, or it is again changing. And it's changing because we're having these conversations, and it's also changing because there are people like us that have the privilege of better understanding and knowledge about these things because we live in a different context, and I think that we owe it to our people, to make sure that we're part of the solution in whichever way we can, in whichever small way we can be, and you're doing that.
More advocacy. There needs to be more. There needs to be more advocates on this. There needs to be more sponsorship for this.
Yes.
Talking about this, coming out to the world and say that, if your kid has autism, it's completely fine. Come out and speak. Because I have seen parents struggling to tell the neighbors that they have autistic children. And I don't know how to deal with it. I'm just giving autism as an example.
No, I was just thinking, even with the parents, you've got dementia, we've got Parkinson's, you've got, you've got some real challenges culturally where it's a taboo to speak about certain topics, or there's a stigma attached to, people make up all sorts of things. So you're right, it is, how do we raise awareness? How do we educate? How do we do it from a place of compassion and not judgment. And I think that's the biggest thing, is how do we get more curious, and how do we catch out judgments of whoever is saying whatever,
So beautiful.
and actually get, look at them from a place of curiosity and compassion, recognizing that they're not holding the privilege of understanding and having learned that we hold.
And it's more driven by, again, quoting one of the famous authors from India called Tilak. He said, your future is not built in your parliaments, your future is built in the classrooms.
Yes.
And how does schools or the teaching system, the education system should do? And both from, let's touch base on this from both angles, Obi. One, from being compassionate, understanding the world is one, because these are the kids who are going to be the leaders in the world tomorrow, and they're going to impact or influence thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. Like how generation is now, one influencer can impact 10 million, 20 million people. And if that influencer brings the compassion as an advocacy, then the world will change. World will become a beautiful place for everyone to live. So what's your take on that? I mean, how should the education, and what are you seeing in this country or compared to other countries as well?
I think education is such a crucial place for us all to give attention. I've always been a governor when my kids were in primary school. I was a school governor. I'm now in secondary school. I'm a school governor.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I take on that role is actually curiosity and to understand how things work from the other side. Because I think that, especially as parents, it's very easy to just point fingers, right? Yeah. And I have such huge compassion for doctors, teachers. They don't have it easy. And when I say that, I think when we look at it from this inclusion perspective and the classrooms, we can't guarantee that all the teachers know what they don't know. Right? So I ran a session a few years back on anti-racism, the anti-racist classroom for a local school. Just volunteered to do it for the teachers, and they were so grateful because there was so much that they weren't aware of in terms of experiences. And you're right, that's they are kind of building the children of the future, and we're not equipping them with the space, as we were talking about earlier, bringing it back to a previous conversation, with the space to think and the space to develop themselves and the space to do the research, because they're just so busy. But when you then take it back to the child, I think, you shared some, very beautiful and touching and wow experiences about your childhood. And that child starts there, that leader, as you said, starts there.
Yeah.
And it's, again, our responsibilities as grown-ups to leave this a better world for our children, across all facets of diversity. So it's something that we don't pay enough attention. I think that maybe growing up, if I think of myself growing up in Nigeria, the village raises the child. It's not necessarily the same here. And it's not necessarily the same in a lot of countries, and you can see the impact of it. I think we tend to be quite siloed in our own worlds. I was watching one of those clips. I think my daughter was showing this to me this morning. I don't know if you saw it. A woman on a bus or a train, and there was a child having a tantrum, and this woman, who I assume is African, turns around and basically tells the child off, and the child shuts up right away, And I was like, see, that's how I grew up, right? It wasn't just my parents. It wasn't just the whole community was watching.
The whole ecosystem.
You couldn't get away with anything, even if you'd wanted to.
So true. Very well said. And in terms of maybe, again, a bit of controversial question maybe, but yeah, please feel free to tweak it and say things.
Decline.
Yeah, but do you think policymakers, the governments, are doing enough to build, especially on this aspects, because these are all the underprivileged areas that we are touching, or neglected areas maybe in a lot of countries. Maybe UK is definitely doing comparatively better.
Yeah.
Talking about mental health and all that stuff, but all these leaders who are coming to you are privileged enough to pay to an executive coach and get it right. But think about a child who couldn't have done this.
Yes.
Are the policymakers doing enough, or the governments doing enough? Do you see?
Yeah,
Because you worked with UNO as well,
yeah,
right?
I've done quite a few work with different organizations and agencies, but I think it's maybe it's the question is not, are they doing enough? Maybe because that almost seems like we're judging rather than really getting curious. You know, I think there's something about how, what do they need?
Yeah.
And are we all doing enough?
Correct.
Because there's something about gosh, policymakers have their hands full too. So everyone, there's just too much.
Yeah.
And actually, it goes back to what my whole work is about, which is, are we maximizing the resources that we have? Are we really, when someone says to me, or when a leader or a manager says to me, I'm really short-staffed, I can get quite provocative about that and challenge that, because is it that we don't have enough people, or is it that we're not maximizing the resources that we have? And that is, for me, the crux of harnessing diversity. I think that we get so tied into, this is Ganesh and that's your job, that we don't ask enough questions. We don't look beyond the job descriptions to see the human and the individual and the experiences they bring, especially now. I mean, if this generation, they are involved in so many things outside of work, and they bring so many skills, and for some reason the systems are created in a way that they think they have to leave that stuff outside. So I think that whether it's policymakers, whether it's government, whether it's whatever kind of leadership role that we're playing in whichever context, I think more needs to be done in terms of engaging people differently. And actually looking at what is it my remit, and what do I need to do that is mine, that nobody else can do. And it's often very little. And how do I open up spaces for other people to develop and for other people to be part of the solution? And there are lots of people wanting to be involved. So if I go back to your question, are they doing enough? I think I'd probably say, to what extent are they really harnessing the diversity and the talent and the support that they could use? Because they need a lot.
True, so true. Very well said. I think very well, beautifully summed up there. I would love to have this conversation going for hours, but I think I'm sure we can come back again, discuss about a lot of stuff. But thank you so much, Obie, for exceptional insights.
Thank
and
you.
Especially, I'm really proud I got you here on Women's Day special, because women leaders are prominent right now, and they're doing exceptionally well every part of the world. And especially in this area, executive coaching. I'm sure I've met a lot of people before, and kudos to your book, by the way. And we spoke a lot of content from your book.
Yes.
In a but you want to close a statement from your end? Do you want to mention about your Let Go leadership book?
Yes.
Or something like that? And what is that, like, top 3 priorities or call out areas that you want the world to look at?
I think, so my book is called Let Go Leadership, How Inclusive Leaders Share Power to Drive High Performance. And actually, we've spoken very much about the book. I think everything we've spoken about is pretty much in the book, in some form or the other. But in the context of the conversation that we've had, I think what's really crucial for us to look at, and why I wrote the book, is that it started out as a book called Get Out of Your Team's Way. And then I decided to be a little bit nicer. And I'll tell you why, because when I then started interviewing leaders about the book, I realized exactly what you were saying, that actually the reason the leaders were not getting out of their team's way was because they hadn't had the privilege of that mindset shift. So the book is actually written in 2 parts. I went back and wrote self-leadership as the first part of the book, because I realized that unless leaders do that mindset work and do their own self-work, they're not going to be able to share leadership, because diversity and talent remains a threat to them. So Let Go Leadership is actually not just about letting go of leadership, but actually doing your own self-work first and recognizing what holds you back, so that you're able to then share leadership. And it's been fascinating talking about this. My brain's going, so I have a lot to think about. But thank you very much, Ganesh, for having me on this day. I've enjoyed it.
Pleasure. I'm sure my audience would have loved this conversation. Thank you so much for continued support, our audience. Do watch this episode and share this with your friends and colleagues, especially the leaders. Yeah, I'm sure. And my LinkedIn has a lot of leaders being followers, and amazing actually the content that I'm seeing, and the kind of leadership changes. The future leadership is looking very, very positive
Yes.
and strong. And with that positive note, I would like to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Obie. Thank you, my dear audience. Let's come back again with another guest very soon in another episode. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank
Brilliant.
you, Ganesh.
Thank you, Obie.
Thank you. That's
Brilliant.
brilliant.